What if I told you the most iconic ingredient in Italian cooking never existed in ancient Rome? No tomatoes, no red sauces, no margarita, anything. For over 1,000 years, Romans built an entire cuisine without a single tomato in sight because they didn't have them. Tomatoes were still growing wild across the Atlantic, unknown to Europe, unseen by Roman hands. But Roman food wasn't bland. It wasn't waiting for tomatoes to show up. It was thriving, with bold, brilliant, inventive flavors that came from something else entirely. And that's the real story. This isn't just about what Rome was missing. It's about what they used instead, and how they built one of the world's greatest food systems without the thing we think it couldn't survive without. So let's rewind the taste of history and meet the ingredients that filled the plate before the tomato ever arrived. Tomatoes feel so essential to Italian food, it's hard to imagine a world without them. But for most of Roman history, that world wasn't imaginary. It was reality. Tomatoes are native to Mesoamerica, specifically to what is now Mexico and Central America. They were cultivated by the Aztecs and other indigenous peoples long before Europeans even knew the Americas existed. The first European to encounter tomatoes was likely Hernán Cortés, who brought them back to Spain after the conquest of the Aztec Empire in the early 1500s, about 1,000 years after the fall of Rome, which means that Julius Caesar never dipped bread into tomato sauce. Nero never saw a tomato. Apicius, Rome's most famous food writer, didn't even have a word for it. In fact, when tomatoes did arrive in Europe, they were met with suspicion. Many believed they were poisonous. Early botanical drawings list them alongside deadly nightshades and ornamental plants. For decades, they were grown more for looks than for flavor. They wouldn't become a staple in Italian cooking until the 18th century, over 1,200 years after the Roman Empire collapsed. So yes, tomatoes are Italian now, but they were never Roman. And while their bright red tang defines much of what we think Italian food is, Rome never needed it to define theirs, because the Romans didn't wait for tomatoes. They had a full flavor system, long before the Americas ever sent them fruit. If you've watched our past videos, you've already met garum, Rome's legendary fermented fish sauce. But for those who haven't, here's the quick explanation. Garum was made by layering whole fish, salt, and herbs in clay vats and letting them ferment under the sun for weeks. The result? A sharp, salty, umami-rich liquid Romans poured on nearly everything. But when it comes to tomatoes, garum didn't just fill in for flavor, it filled in for an entire category of cooking. The Roman world had no tomatoes, no soy sauce, no mushrooms, no Worcestershire. But they had garum, and that gave them depth, richness, and balance across dishes, from stews to grilled meats to vegetables. What's often overlooked is how garum was more than just a sauce, it was a system. Garum production became a trade empire of its own. There were factories along the coasts of Spain and North Africa. Amphorae filled with garum were stamped, sealed, and shipped across the Mediterranean like olive oil or wine. Cities built their economy around it, and unlike tomatoes, which need farming, water, and sun, garum needed only what the sea left behind: guts, bones, scraps. For the poor, it was scooped from common vats. For the elite, it was refined and aged. Garum wasn't red. It wasn't beautiful. But it did for Rome what tomatoes later did for everyone else. It made food whole. Garum gave Roman food its depth. But when it came to sharpness, that bite, that tang we often associate with tomatoes, the Romans turned to vinegar and verjuice. These were the acids of the ancient kitchen. Vinegar came from wine left too long. Verjuice was the juice of unripe grapes, green, sour, and powerfully astringent. You'll find them mentioned all over ancient Roman texts, especially in recipes from Apicius, where both were mixed with honey, wine, or herbs to make sauces that added brightness to dishes without overwhelming them. In a world without lemons and without tomatoes, these acidic liquids became the balancing act. Romans used them to cut through fatty meat, sweet fruits, or oily legumes, the same way we use balsamic or citrus today. But vinegar wasn't just for flavor. It was functional. Soldiers drank a vinegar water mix called pasca. not just to refresh, but to kill bacteria in the water supply. It was medicinal, preservative, and practical. Verjuice, on the other hand, was a chef's tool. Sour but not alcoholic, it added clean acidity to everything from boiled lentils to grilled fish. It was especially important in sauces where wine was too strong and vinegar too sharp. While tomatoes later gave sauces a natural tang, Rome didn't need them to find balance. They already knew how to make sweet and sour work, just without the fruit we now take for granted. Vinegar made food last. Verjuice made food bright. And together, they made sure Rome's meals were never flat. If vinegar and verjuice added brightness, wine and grape must brought something softer. Warmth, depth, and a subtle sweetness that modern sauces often get from tomatoes. Grape must, the freshly pressed juice of grapes, skins and all, was boiled down into rich syrups like defrutum and sapa. These weren't used in desserts. They were used in meat dishes, vegetables, even sauces for fish. Defrutum gave body to stews. It thickened broths. It glazed slow-cooked meats. Its deep color and rich texture could turn bland lentils into something almost luxurious. And it didn't just add sweetness. It added structure, the same way tomatoes do in a ragu or a reduction. Romans also added wine directly to cooking, especially red wine in savory dishes. It wasn't thrown in casually. It was often reduced first, then combined with vinegar, herbs, or garum to build complex, savory sauces. And unlike tomatoes, which grow in a single season and spoil quickly, could be stored, fermented, boiled, reduced, or transformed. It was adaptable, and in a climate like Rome's, abundant. This is one of the biggest things people get wrong about ancient Roman food. It wasn't flat, it wasn't beige, it had acidity, spice, salt, and it absolutely had sweetness. Just not from sugar, not from ketchup, and definitely not from tomatoes. So next time you swirl wine into a sauce or taste something sweet savory that lingers, remember, that's not modern fusion. That's ancient Roman logic. With no tomatoes to lean on, Romans had to find flavor elsewhere, and they found it in herbs. But not just basil and oregano. Rome's kitchens ran on bold, now-forgotten plants like lovage, dill, and rue, herbs that today sit in the shadows, if they're remembered at all. Lovage was one of the most used herbs in Roman recipes. It looks a bit like celery, but its flavor is sharper, greener, almost spicy. It was minced into sauces, added to bean dishes, and boiled into broths. In the absence of tomatoes, lovage gave dishes body, a strong base that clung to the tongue. Dill added brightness, especially with fish and vegetables. Not as sweet as fennel, not as minty as parsley, dill gave a light herbal tang that worked beautifully alongside vinegar and must. Rue, on the other hand, was bold, bitter, aromatic, and slightly numbing. It was used sparingly, a few leaves to cut through fat or enhance sweetness by contrast. Today, it's often left out due to its strength, but back then it was a vital flavor tool. These herbs weren't just seasonings. They were the frame for Roman cuisine. They allowed cooks, especially poor ones, to turn grains and legumes into something layered and complete. The modern obsession with tomatoes often drowns out these foundational flavors. But the Romans didn't miss them, because they never had them, and they knew how to make a dish come alive with plants we've almost forgotten. If tomatoes gave us comfort, herbs gave them complexity, and they did it without needing a red base to hide behind. When Roman cooks needed sweetness, to balance vinegar, garum, or the bitter bite of herbs, they didn't reach for sugar or tomatoes. They reached for fruit. Figs, dates, pomegranates, and grapes were the sweeteners of the Roman world. And unlike the sugar we know today, these fruits came with fiber, texture, and depth. They didn't just dissolve, they contributed. Dried figs were boiled into syrups. Dates were mashed and stirred into stews. Pomegranate juice added tang and richness to meat sauces. Even raisins were used in savory dishes, giving bursts of sweetness where modern dishes would use brown sugar or a dash of ketchup. These weren't afterthoughts. They were core ingredients, especially in poorer kitchens where a handful of chopped fruit could turn grain mush or lentils into something that felt designed, not desperate. Recipes from Apicius describe meat dishes seasoned with pepper, garum, vinegar, and dates, or honey, or defrutum. The layering of sweet, sour, salty, and sharp was intentional, and fruits were at the center of that equation. Today, we still see echoes of it. Tagines with apricots, pork with apples, cheese with grapes. But in Rome, these weren't trends. They were standard. Balanced flavor wasn't an invention. It was ancient. The tomato would eventually collapse sweet and sour into one neat package. But before it arrived, Roman cooks had to build that balance one ingredient at a time. And often, that meant fruit, ripe, dried, pressed, or reduced, doing the quiet work behind every dish. When we think of cheese today, we picture slices, toppings, boards, or maybe a little sprinkled Parmesan. But in ancient Rome, cheese, and dairy in general, was a culinary building block, not just a garnish. Romans made a wide variety of cheeses, fresh, aged, soft, and hard. But what they relied on most in cooking was the kind that barely resembled modern blocks: crumbled, tangy, fermented dairy that could melt into broths, thickened sauces, or flavor grains. This kind of cheese added body, salt, creaminess. It filled the role tomatoes often play today, rounding out sauces, binding ingredients, and softening acidity from vinegar or wine. Sour milk, fermented curds, and strained whey also had a place in the Roman kitchen, especially in rural or lower-class households. These were used in porridges, vegetable dishes, and even with meat. Fermentation made them more digestible and added that gentle tang that modern sauces get from tomato paste or creme fraiche. Even Apicius, who wrote for the elite, included multiple dishes featuring soft cheese blended with herbs, nuts, or honey, ingredients that added texture and balance. Meanwhile, for the poor, a bit of aged curd stirred into barley was the difference between bland and nourishing. We don't see cheese this way today. We often separate it from sauce entirely. But Romans didn't. Cheese wasn't just protein, it was structure. And it's a reminder. Without tomatoes, Roman flavor didn't collapse. It diversified. Sometimes the heart of the dish wasn't red. Sometimes it was white, soft, and just tangy enough to hold it all together. In modern cooking, legumes are often a side note. Fiber, filler, something to keep vegetarians satisfied. But in ancient Rome, beans, lentils, and peas weren't just nutrition. They were the base of the meal, and sometimes the sauce itself. With no tomatoes to thicken or stretch a stew, peasants and cooks alike turned to legumes. Boiled down and mashed, they became creamy, rich, and protein-dense, the original thickener for broths, porridges, and even meat sauces. Lentils were among the most widely used, appearing in military rations, rural diets, and elite cookbooks. They were inexpensive, easy to grow, and stored for years. Romans would blend them with vinegar, garum, oil, and herbs, turning them into flavorful purees that layered perfectly into grain dishes or flatbreads. Fava beans were another staple, heartier and earthier, used especially among the poor and in religious festivals. They were often blended with garlic, onions, or cheese to make spreads and fillings. The result wasn't flashy, but it was warm, thick, and sustaining. Romans didn't have cream, they didn't have tomato puree, they didn't even have butter. But with legumes, they had texture, body, and weight, a way to carry flavor instead of just pouring it. Today, this technique is quietly coming back. We see chickpea purees, lentil-based sauces, and bean emulsions in fine dining again. But for Roman peasants, this wasn't a trend. It was dinner. Legumes didn't just feed Rome, they gave its food shape, long before the world thought to call it sauce. Most of the ingredients Rome used instead of tomatoes were practical: herbs, vinegars, legumes. But one was legendary: silphium. Silphium was a plant so prized by the Romans that it was said to be worth its weight in silver. It was used in medicine, perfumes, and, most famously, cooking. Its taste was strong, aromatic, somewhere between garlic, fennel, and asafoetida. The entire plant was valuable: stalks, resin, roots. A tiny bit of it could flavor a whole dish. Romans used it in sauces, stews, and roasted meats, anywhere a dish needed something extra. Some claimed it also worked as birth control, which only added to its mystery. But silphium had a problem. It only grew in one narrow coastal strip of North Africa in what is now Libya. Despite many attempts, it couldn't be cultivated. Every stalk was wild and harvested by hand. Over time, demand rose, supply dwindled, and eventually it vanished. Pliny the Elder wrote that the last known stalk was picked and presented to Emperor Nero. And then, nothing. It was gone. No one has successfully identified it since. Some think it was a variety of ferula. Others believe it's extinct. What's clear is that Rome never truly replaced it. Nothing else had the same flavor, the same punch, the same lore. Tomatoes would eventually become the new center of flavor, but silphium was Rome's original, a flavor so powerful the empire mourned its absence for centuries. Not every lost ingredient leaves a hole. Silphium left a shadow. When people picture ancient Roman food, they imagine red sauces, pasta with tomato, pizzas smothered in marinara. But none of that existed. Rome had no tomatoes, no chili peppers, no potatoes, no corn. And yet, the food was anything but bland. Roman cuisine was built like architecture, in layers. First came salt, often from garum, but also from brine or anchovies. Then came sourness, vinegar, verjuice, or wine. Then sweetness, defrutum, honey, dried fruits. Then bitterness, herbs like rue or lovage. And finally, fat, olive oil, or meat if you could afford it. Every dish was balanced. Sweet and sour weren't opposites. They were partners. Texture mattered just as much as taste. Legumes thickened, fruit sweetened, vinegar cut through fat. Garum gave a hit of umami where none should exist. The result wasn't tomato-based. It wasn't red. It was deep gold, dark brown, sometimes even green or beige. But it was layered, bold, strange by modern standards, but complex in a way we're only just starting to appreciate again. Without tomatoes, Roman food never leaned on one ingredient to carry the dish. Every bite had to be earned. It was a system, a logic, not just a flavor. Today, we've simplified. We add tomatoes and let them carry sweetness, acidity, and color all at once. That's efficient, but it's also forgetful. Rome's food was built before shortcuts. And maybe that's the point, because if you take away the tomato, what's left behind is an emptiness. It's everything else they knew how to do. Tomatoes are everywhere now, on pasta, in soup, in ketchup packets, in your glove box. But for over 1,000 years, Rome built a cuisine without them. And not by accident, by necessity, by creativity, by deep understanding of balance. They didn't wait for the right ingredients to arrive. They built a flavor system out of what was already there. Fish bones, herbs, sour grapes, dried figs, and fermented milk. And when the tomato finally did arrive, it was added on top of that legacy, not in place of it. So yes, we love tomatoes, but Roman food never needed them to matter. And maybe that's the quiet lesson. If you know your land and you trust your tools, you don't wait for flavor to be imported. You grow it from the ground up.